Talking all things SEC here on SEC Unfiltered. Make sure that you like and subscribe and turn on the bell notifications for every time we post a new video. Also, check us out on every social media platform: Instagram, Facebook, X, and of course, TikTok at SEC Unfiltered. And joining me today to talk everything Georgia football, a lot has been going on in that culture for sure, is none other than Dawgs 247. It's Jordan Hill. Jordan, what's going on, man?
Hey, Lucas. Not a lot. Just football's right around the corner. Georgia just started fall camp, so no shortage of stuff to talk about for sure.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And then let's go ahead and just get into this. Yesterday, it was reported first by you, I believe, that Rara Thomas, after almost a week to the day, I want to say, after he was arrested on charges of child endangerment, among other charges, he has been dismissed from the Georgia football program. This was a guy that kind of had an up and down season last year, but was expected to be a playmaker this upcoming year. Um, what does this loss mean for the Georgia Bulldogs, and how deep are they now when you look at the receiver position?
Yeah, I'd say it's significant. I think Rara had a real chance to be their starting X receiver. It was either going to be him or Colby Young, a guy they picked up from Miami before spring and had an outstanding spring practice. So I think even if Rara wouldn't have been the starting X, he would have played quite a bit. And you look back, last year was his first year at Georgia. He had been at Mississippi State before. He had shown flashes. He wound up having a foot injury in November that pretty much ended his season and as we now know, basically his Georgia career. And they're going to need receivers to step up. They've only got 10 scholarship receivers now that Rara is gone. Colby Young, like I said, I think will probably be the front runner to be that starter at X. But Dylan Bell, a guy that has played quite a bit in the last couple of years and had a really strong November and December for Georgia, he's going to step up. I wouldn't be surprised to see him in that spot some as well. London Humphreys is a guy that I think will have to step up if Dylan Bell plays a little bit more X. Nitro Tuggle, a true freshman they got out of the state of Indiana, he's going to be asked to step up and do a lot more. I think losing Rara Thomas, it's not the end of the world. It doesn't totally derail Georgia's passing game, but it's a pretty crucial hit. They're going to need other guys to step up without a veteran in this offense, and some of those guys are going to be guys who are new to Georgia, like a Colby Young, and some of them are true freshmen like Nitro Tuggle, who are going to have to learn what it takes to be an SEC receiver.
Yeah, and looking at your tweet on what Kirby Smart had to say about the transfer receivers, they're doing great. They're doing an awesome job. No concerns there. Talk to me about those guys like London Humphreys, like you mentioned, and just among the other receivers that have performed, that have come through the transfer portal, and how they've adjusted to Mike Bobo's offense.
Yeah, I think the big question was how quickly they would learn it. And Georgia sort of went through that last off season when they picked up Rara Thomas and Dominic Lovett. And Dominic kind of picked up the offense quicker than Rara did. And it seemed like it really took the summer before Rara really got comfortable. But, Georgia picked up three guys: Lennon Humphreys, Michael Jackson from USC, Colby Young from Miami. And, Colby's sort of been the talk so far. We'll see how he does in fall camp, but he might have been the most talked about Bulldog, period, during spring practice because he had an outstanding spring. But London Humphreys is the guy they're super excited about. He was just a freshman at Vanderbilt last year, had a 49-yard touchdown catch against Georgia on Vanderbilt's opening drive. And I think that Georgia staff said, all right, we need to remember this kid. Let's write that name down. And he winds up going in the portal and winds up coming to Georgia. Michael Jackson is a guy that's battled injury while he was at USC. Big punt returner, a guy that can be dangerous. And I think we're still waiting to see him sort of turn the corner at Georgia. But, yeah, I mean, I think it's a situation where they understand everybody they've got in the room right now has to be ready. And, watching James Coley, the new receivers coach who was at Georgia before, working really hands-on with that entire group when we watched them at practice on Thursday, they understand that they've got a really big opportunity. You got Carson Beck back for his senior season. You've got a really good offensive line that I think has a chance to win the Joe Moore Award. They need to take advantage of it as pass catchers, and we'll see which ones break out. I'd say Colby Young of the transfers is the best positioned to start and play a big role. But I'd watch Lennon Humphreys too because he's young, but he showed out while he was at Vanderbilt last season.
Do you see a guy like Trevor Etienne really becoming part of that, kind of playing like an Alvin Kamara type of player?
I think he can be, and I think that it's going to be fascinating, especially early in the season, just to see how productive he can be. I think that he's a guy that you kind of wonder if what was around him in Florida, maybe held him back. He was their second leading rusher, I want to say the last 2 years behind Montrell Johnson. But Trevor's looked the part in what we've gotten to watch, even going back to the spring. He didn't get a lot of carries at G Day, but I thought he was impressive with his straight line speed. He broke a big run up the middle at one point in that scrimmage. So I think he's got the capability of being a big time player. I'll be curious to see how much they use him in the passing game. He's got that ability. I think he's going to be Georgia's lead back, and I think he's got a chance to put together a really strong season.
He talked about earlier, I think back in either February or March, that he'd rather be a running back one on a team that's going to be contending for a national title instead of just being a running back two on a team that could potentially go 5-7 this year. And speaking of that comparison, this isn't the first time that we've seen Georgia football kind of be in the news for a little bit of the wrong reasons, not just with Rara Thomas. It's the second guy from this Georgia team that has been arrested and been dismissed. The second one being David Daniels Sisvana, who was dismissed not too long ago. It seems like there's been a history of reckless driving, just some little stupid issues that have really plagued this Georgia team, but everything gets blown over because they just continue to win. And that sparks a big difference when you look at a team like Georgia and when you look at a team like Florida, whose their issues are all on the kitchen counter because of how bad they've been the last 2 years. So let me just ask you this. It seems like winning changes everything, but do you think that this is an issue that Kirby Smart needs to address and needs to address quick?
Well, looking at the driving situations, it's something Kirby talked about at SEC Media Days. And he brought up something that none of the media in the room were aware of, that the Classic City Collective, which is Georgia's NIL collective, have withheld funds from players who have have had driving violations, who have run into issues with the law. I mean, it's basically as close as Georgia could come to fining these players. But you mentioned they kicked off David Daniel Sisavon. Kirby wouldn't say specifically what the reason was. Violation of team rules is what Kirby said, but David had multiple driving offenses, so I'd have to imagine that at least played a part. And I sort of set the Rara situation on its own because the severity of those charges, battery, cruelty to children, a little bit different than driving your car too fast down the road, which obviously is dangerous, but totally different circumstances. So I think it's a situation where Georgia understands the ramifications, especially when you've seen the habitual issues with the reckless driving charges. Kirby said there's going to be suspensions out of some of those situations. He's not one to say who is suspended and for how long, but I do think they understand the severity of having these recurring issues. They had an accident in January of 2023 that wound up costing 2 lives, and I think everyone around the program understands that these things can't keep happening, and that frankly they're really lucky that no one else has been injured in a situation much like had happened that January.
Yeah, that'll be enough for Georgia's problems. That'll be all that we talk about today. So now back to the football side of everything. Going back to spring practice, let's talk about the defensive line and outside backers for a bit. And you put out a recent article about an hour ago, actually, just recapping their defensive line. You talked about Nazir Stackhouse and Christian Miller, who could be breakout stars in 2024. Stackhouse, a two-time All-SEC, has the potential to be a late-round, first-round draft pick, maybe even a day 2 pick if that is the case. But the biggest question for me, though, is Michael Williams. Did we ever? I know you mentioned that you've seen him as an option at defensive end and also somewhere on outside backer. Where was he mostly during the first practice yesterday?
He was a little bit split up, and we only got to watch about 15 minutes. But I think this is a situation where you're going to see him standing up a lot more. And I think that, Michael kind of came to that realization toward the end of his sophomore year. And, I kind of think he sees his sophomore year as sort of a lost year. He had been dealing with a foot injury in spring practice. It cut his spring practice short. He was kind of playing catch up going into fall camp last year. And Kirby talked about it at SEC Media Days and was like, it's basically never a good situation when a guy's trying to catch up, get back into shape, trying to get where he needs to be a little bit late in the calendar when it comes to fall camp. I think Michael Williams is a guy that, we could be talking about a top 5, top 10 pick when we get to April next year. So I think they understand they have a chance to really utilize his versatility and make him basically a de facto edge rusher. That not only allows him to stand up, play a little bit more outside linebacker in 2024, but they've got some really interesting options at defensive end behind him. Gabe Harris is one that has really shined this offseason. Tyrion Ingram Dawkins is an older guy who's waiting for his turn. So, yeah, Mike Hill, he was moving around a little bit while we got to watch about 3 team periods of practice on Thursday. I think we're going to see him splitting his time fairly evenly between outside linebacker and defensive end. And I think they think he's one of their best pass rushers, and I do think he's getting ready to show that.
Is Coach Schumann still running 4 down linemen?
It's usually a 3 down front. They usually
Okay.
have a big nose tackle and then the 2.
That makes sense. Because you're going to have that outside backer coming out on the outside, that 5 tech or outside of 9. So, Jordan D. Hill from Dawgs 247 Sports joining us here on SEC Unfiltered. Want to go ahead and give a shout out to our good friends over at RHOBACK. If you guys haven't heard of RHOBACK, time to check them out. There's plenty of clothing options for them, from the performance holos to the hoodies, the shorts, for the best fit and the best feel. Going over to RHOBACK.com and use code SECU and get yourself 20% off of your first purchase. When you look at the offensive side of the football, we've talked about the receivers already. We've talked about the offensive line briefly. How has Carson Beck's development been since the end of last year when he got hot after the Ole Miss game?
I think the biggest thing is that he feels comfortable sort of leading the people around him. He talked about this during spring practice where, he wins a starting job in the fall camp last year. And he said, there were times where I kind of didn't feel like I could speak up. I'm going through this for the first time as a starter. He said, now that, I understand I'm QB1 and that, what I say resonates with people. And from what we've heard from the people around him, I think that Carson's taken that leadership to heart. Tate Ratledge, we talked to him on Thursday, and he said, that Carson understands that when he speaks, people listen. So I think that's huge. I think the fact that he's got another year under his belt, another offseason working with some of the receivers we talked about earlier, Dominic Lovett, Dylan Bell, and then also Oscar Delp, one of the top tight ends on this team. So I think for Carson, this was just a big offseason, and understanding his role on the team, I thought he had an outstanding 2023 for Georgia. Did a much better job than I expected taking care of the football. You look at a guy that it had been 3 or 4 years since he had really played big time reps. I mean, we're going back to high school for Carson, but he did a very good job of taking care of the ball throughout the year, making winning plays. I understand why there's a lot of people who have him as a Heisman favorite. I don't know if he's going to be able to make that happen, but I do think he's going to have a very, very productive senior season for Georgia.
How has Oscar Delp and Benjamin Urasek been so far? Just have they been kind of splitting, playing with ones, or has there been a clear-cut number one so far from day one?
So Georgia just got started on Thursday, but it looks like Oscar Delp is the main guy. And we were talking about this on our podcast, looking at Ben Urasek, who just got here in the summer. You can kind of tell he has not had a full off season as far as going through Georgia's workout routine and workout schedule. I think he's a guy that is going to contribute quite a bit. And I think it made a lot of sense for him to come to Georgia. But just based on what we've seen briefly so far, I think Oscar Delp is your starting tight end. This is a big opportunity during fall camp for Ben Urasek to prove himself. Georgia's one that has used a lot of multiple tight end sets. in these last few years when you've had such really good tight ends in that room. I don't see this year being any different, but those tight ends are going to have to compete with. Again, we talked about the depth issues at receiver, but I do think they're pretty top heavy. So there's going to be those receivers wanting to be out there, get 3 receivers out there, and you can only have so many receivers and tight ends at one time. So I think that's going to be a pretty fun competition, just trying to get those guys to prove who are the most productive pass catchers on this team.
A couple more questions for you, Jordan. I've heard a lot of people talk about Carson Beck and the season that he could have this year. Do you potentially see this guy having a Joe Burrow type of season?
It's possible. I mean, I think the biggest thing with Carson is that he's going to have opportunities to show he's the best quarterback in the country. And you look at Georgia's schedule, starting with Clemson, obviously that's going to catch a lot of people's attention early on, but you play at Alabama, you play at Texas, you play at Ole Miss. Carson's going to have an opportunity to prove himself in some really tough environments. And, I think the biggest thing to me, if someone were to ask me for a critique of Carson or something that I need to see, Carson sort of get better at, it's the deep ball. I think that's something that he's not been the most accurate with in the time he's been Georgia's starter. Even going back to the spring game this year, I felt like he had some missed opportunities on some deep shots. I think he does have a chance to be that Heisman contender, to be the top quarterback. And then, you look to the NFL draft next year to, potentially be the first quarterback taken. But I think he needs to take a step forward when it comes to taking advantage of shots down the field. If he can do that, I think this Georgia offense is going to be super dangerous throughout the year.
Last question for you. You're a big NASCAR guy. Kyle Larson just took the lead in the NASCAR Cup Series. Does he maintain that lead?
It's going to be interesting to watch. I think the biggest thing for me is it's such a crapshoot with how the playoffs work now with the Final Four. And we've seen the last few years with Joe Logano and Ryan Blaney getting hot in the races that matter. I keep thinking this might be the year Denny Hamlin finally breaks through and wins a championship. But, I think Kyle Larson, he's been there. He's probably the best NASCAR driver who's never won a championship. But it's hard to bet against Kyle Larson. He's just so good behind the wheel. It's fun to watch. I think he's the best, pure driver on the sport right now. So he's got a really good shot, but we'll see what winds up happening.
Yeah, Hamlin's been through hell over the last 2 or 3 years at least. So a win for him in the playoff, once we get to playoff contention, is going to be big for him. Jordan D. Hill over at Dawgs 247. Check out a couple of his articles over at Dawgs 247. Follow him on Twitter at Jordan Davis Hill. Jordan, pleasure having you on the show, my man, and have a great weekend, my brother.
All right, thanks.
Thank you guys for listening in to SEC Unfiltered. Make sure you hit the bell notification so that you are notified for every time we post a new video. Make sure you hit us up on Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok. Also, check out secunfiltered.com for more SEC content from the best SEC entity on the internet. So, for Jordan, for Lucas, I'm saying so long.